A woman thought she had the right to do whatever she wanted, even if it meant taking over someone else's space. But what she didn't expect was that the true owner was a welder with limited patience and a brilliantly creative plan for revenge. You won't believe what happens next as the shed door slowly gets welded shut. Don't miss it. The first sign was polite, a simple computer-printed sheet of paper, slipped into a plastic sleeve and taped to the large roll-up door of his workshop, private property. No parking. Please. Jack Huda had thought that was clear enough. He was a simple man who wanted simple things: the quiet hum of his machinery, the smell of ozone from his welder, and the absolute, undisputed right to park his own truck in his own workshop. The workshop was his sanctuary, a steel and cinderblock cathedral he'd bought after 20 years as a combat engineer. It was where the chaotic noise of the world and the louder noise of his memories finally went quiet. The sign lasted exactly one day before a cherry red sports car, sleek and obnoxious, was parked directly in front of it, blocking the entrance completely. Jack, returning with a truck bed full of steel beams, had to park on the street, a major inconvenience that required him to haul the heavy materials an extra 50 yards. He'd left a note on the windshield. Firmer this time. This is not public parking. You are blocking access to a private workshop. Please do not park here again, thank you. The second time it happened. 2 days later, Jack recognized the car. He'd seen it gliding through the manicured streets of the adjacent, upscale housing development, always driven by the same woman. She had a helmet of perfectly coiffed, unnaturally blonde hair and a posture that screamed entitlement. He later learned her name was Karen, and she was the newly elected president of the Home Owners Association. Apparently, her authority, in her mind, extended beyond the pristine lawns and identical mailboxes of her suburban kingdom and into his industrial, grease-stained domain. This time, Jack's patience began to fray. He was a man who understood rules and chains of command. Respect was the lubricant that kept society's gears from grinding to a halt. Karen was throwing sand in the engine. He installed a more permanent sign, bolting a professionally made metal plate to the wall. Ask first, below it, in a fit of bitter humor. He'd added another, smaller sign he'd picked up from a novelty shop in Singapore years ago, a quirky souvenir from his travels that read, "Huda can't park Bo here." It was a Singlish inside joke, a phrase that meant something like, "Who the hell says you can park here?" It was his own little piece of defiance, a private joke against the encroaching arrogance. For a week, the space remained empty. Jack allowed himself to hope. He was preparing for a trip, a long overdue, 3-week fishing excursion to the remote lakes of northern Maine. It was a pilgrimage he took every few years to reset his soul. His bags were packed, his fishing gear was oiled and ready, and his neighbor was paid to look after his cat. All that was left was to load up his truck and go. On the morning of his departure, he opened his front door and his heart sank. There, nestled comfortably inside his workshop, was the red sports car. The roll-up door was wide open. Karen hadn't just parked in front of it. She had invited herself in. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. She had found the door unlocked. Jack admitted his own lapse in security, having forgotten to lock it the previous evening, and decided his private, secure workshop was now her personal garage. For a long moment, Jack just stood there, the cool morning air doing nothing to calm the hot surge of anger in his chest. He saw all his carefully laid plans, his peaceful escape being threatened by this woman's casual, profound disrespect. He thought of all the steps he'd taken, the polite sign, the firm note, the permanent warnings. All ignored, he had followed the civilized path, and it had led him here. He walked slowly over to the workshop, his boots crunching on the gravel. He peered inside. The car was parked diagonally, taking up as much space as possible. A pair of expensive sunglasses sat on the dashboard. He could smell the faint, cloying scent of her perfume. It felt like a home invasion. He looked at the open door. He looked at the red car, a symbol of smug privilege. Then, his eyes drifted over to the corner of the workshop where his welding equipment sat. The heavy-duty MIG welder, the thick leather gloves, the menacing auto-darkening helmet. An idea began to form. Not in a flash of anger, but in a slow, cold, and meticulous crystallization of purpose. He had tried to communicate with words. He had tried to appeal to common decency. Now it was time to speak the only language she seemed to understand, the language of absolute, unbreachable barriers. A slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had been pushed past his limit and had just discovered a truly creative, deeply satisfying solution. Karen wanted to use his workshop as her private garage find. He would make it official. He wouldn't just be closing the door. He would be sealing it. He walked back to his house, his steps now light and purposeful. He picked up his phone and canceled the cat sitter. He'd be leaving a little later than planned, but he had one last project to complete. His fishing trip could wait a few hours. This, he realized, was far more important. This was about restoring order to his world. He dragged a comfortable chair from his porch and placed it just outside the workshop door. Getting a perfect view, he put on his helmet, picked up the welding gun, and with a steady hand, pulled the trigger. A brilliant, violent blue-white light erupted, and the sharp hiss of melting metal cut through the morning quiet. The first beat of the weld, a permanent steel scar, was laid down. Jack Huda was starting his vacation with a bang. The welding job took Jack just under an hour. He worked with the methodical precision of a surgeon, laying down a thick, unbroken bead of molten steel along the entire seam where the heavy roll-up door met its frame. He didn't just tack it shut in a few spots. He sealed it completely. Fusing the door to the structure of the building itself, he imagined the immense force it would use to break it open. Not a pry bar, not a sledgehammer, but a dedicated team with cutting torches and heavy equipment. When he was done, he stepped back to admire his work. The weld was ugly, brutal, and beautifully permanent. It was a statement. He felt a profound sense of calm settle over him. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about principle. It was about the slow, creeping rot of entitlement that he saw infecting the world. The attitude that rules were for other people. Karen, with her expensive car and her imperious attitude, was a symptom of that disease. And he, Jack Huda, had just administered a rather potent, localized cure. He loaded his fishing gear into his truck, threw in his suitcase, and took one last look at the sealed workshop. He felt no guilt, only a quiet, grim satisfaction. He started the engine and pulled away, heading north toward the promise of pine-scented air and the solitary peace of a boat on a glassy lake. He didn't look back. It was close to noon when Karen returned, humming a self-satisfied tune. The HOA meeting had been a triumph. She had successfully pushed through a new regulation regarding the acceptable shade of beige for garden gnomes. She felt powerful, influential, a shepherd guiding her flock of suburbanites toward a more aesthetically pleasing future. As she approached the workshop, she clicked the remote to open the door. Nothing happened. She clicked it again, harder this time, as if the force of her thumb could will it into submission. Still nothing. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. How inconvenient. She walked up to the door, ready to give the manual handle a firm tug. That's when she saw it. A thick, dark, lumpy scar ran the entire perimeter of the door. It was crude, metallic, and utterly immovable. Her brain took a moment to process what she was seeing. It looked like a weld. That couldn't be right. Who would weld a door shut? It was a bird. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet industrial park. "Is anyone here?" Silence. She pressed her manicured hands against the cold steel. It was as solid as a bank vault. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her composure. She banged her fist on the door. The sound was a dull, unsatisfying thud. "Let me out. Open this door right now." Her voice was shrill, laced with an indignation that was rapidly tipping into fear. She was trapped inside a greasy, dusty workshop. Her red sports car, her symbol of status and freedom, was now a prisoner alongside her. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling. She dialed 911. "I've been kidnapped," she shrieked into the phone. "I'm locked inside a building. Send someone immediately." The dispatcher, practiced in the art of calming hysterics, got the address and the details. Within 15 minutes, a police cruiser arrived. Two officers got out, their expressions a mixture of boredom and professional curiosity. They saw the signs. Private property. Ask first. They examined the weld. One of them let out a low whistle. "Looks like the owner doesn't want anyone in here," one officer said to the other, loud enough for Karen to hear through the door. "I'm in here," she screamed. "He locked me in. This is false imprisonment. Arrest him." "Ma'am, do you own this property?" the officer asked, his voice flat. "No, but he can't just—" "Ma'am, is this your car?" "Yes, he's trapped my car." "So you parked your car inside a building you don't own. That is clearly marked as private property, and the owner appears to have secured his building." The officer summarized, his tone making it clear this was a civil matter, not a high-priority crime. "We'll try to contact the owner, but for now, you're trespassing." The word trespassing struck Karen like a physical blow. A trespasser. The concept was so foreign, so insulting, it short-circuited her brain. The police couldn't help her. The law, which she had always seen as a tool to enforce her will, was now being used against her. Desperation turned to rage. If the world outside wouldn't help, she would have to help herself. She turned away from the door, her eyes scanning the cavernous space of the workshop. It was full of tools. Tools for building, tools for dismantling. Her eyes landed on a heavy-duty fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. An idea, born of pure, unadulterated panic, bloomed in her mind. It was a pressurized canister. Pressure could break things, right? She could blast the lock. She could make a hole, with a grunt of effort. She pulled the heavy red cylinder from its mount. It was heavier than she expected. She fumbled with the pin, her manicured nails scraping against the metal. Finally, she pulled it free. She aimed the nozzle at the sliver of space where the door met the frame, the place where a lock might have been before the weld. She squeezed the handle. A massive, deafening roar erupted as a thick cloud of white chemical powder blasted from the nozzle. The force threw her back a step. The powder filled the air, choking her, coating her perfect blonde hair, her expensive orange jacket, and her cherry-red car in a fine, white dust. It didn't break the lock. It didn't make a hole. It just turned her prison into a chaotic, suffocating snow globe of her own making. Through the haze, she could just make out the small novelty sign on the wall. "Huda can't park Bo here." For the first time, she understood it wasn't a joke. It was a verdict. The white dust settled slowly, a chemical blizzard in reverse. It coated every surface in a fine, ghostly film. Karen stood panting in the center of the workshop, her chest heaving, her fashionable orange jacket now a sickly, mottled white and orange. The acrid smell of the discharge stung her nostrils and made her eyes water. The silence that followed the deafening roar of the extinguisher was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of total, abject failure. She had unleashed her fury on her prison, and all she had accomplished was to defile it, and herself further. Her red car, once a gleaming icon of her success, looked like a forgotten relic, draped in a shroud of dust. For a long time, she simply stood there, immobile. As the reality of her situation cemented itself in her mind, this wasn't a temporary inconvenience to be overcome with a sharp word or a demanding phone call. This was a cage, a bespoke cage built just for her by a man she had dismissed as insignificant. The police were not her private army. Her social standing meant nothing to a quarter-inch of fused steel. A new kind of fear began to creep in, colder and more insidious than the hot panic that had driven her to discharge the extinguisher. It was the fear of anonymity, of being forgotten. What if he never came back? The man, Huda, Was on a trip. He had to be. But for how long then a week, the thought sent a fresh jolt of ice through her veins. Her phone. It was her only link. She pulled it from her pocket, her dusty fingers smearing the screen. 14% battery. A countdown clock to absolute isolation. Her first call was to her husband, Richard. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice clipped and impatient. Karen, I'm about to go into a meeting. What is it? Richard, something terrible has happened, she said, her voice trembling. I'm trapped. I'm locked in this garage place. There was a pause. Locked in? What are you talking about? Did you lock your keys in the car again? No, Richard, you don't understand the owner, this maniac. He welded the door shut from the outside. The police came, but they won't help. They said I was trespassing. The last word came out as a sob of pure indignation. Richard sighed, a long, weary sound she knew all too well. It was the sound he made when one of her social crusades created a logistical problem for him. Welded, Karen. Don't be so dramatic. Just call a locksmith. I have to go. A locksmith can't fix a weld, she shrieked. But the line was already dead. He hadn't listened. He hadn't understood. The casual dismissal from the one person she expected to ride to her rescue was more crushing than the police officer's flat rejection. She was alone. Meanwhile, the initial police report, filed under civil dispute, had already been logged. A bored desk sergeant, amused by the details, mentioned it to his cousin who worked as a cameraman for a local news station. By mid-afternoon, a white news van with the Channel 8 logo emblazoned on its side pulled up to the curb outside Jack's workshop. A reporter named Sarah Jenkins, young, ambitious, and with a keen nose for human interest stories that bordered on the absurd, stepped out. She saw the sealed door, the crude, angry weld stark against the weathered paint. She saw the signs. Private property, and the more intriguing, ask first. She took a few pictures with her phone and started knocking on the doors of the other businesses in the small industrial park. Most were empty, but she found a mechanic 2 units down. A grizzled man named Sal. Huda, yeah, I know Jack, Sal said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. Keeps to himself. Good guy. Though, an old army man. You don't mess with his space. Is that what this is about? He gestured toward the welded door. You could say that. Sarah replied, someone parked in his shop, and it seems he took matters into his own hands. Sal let out a short, barking laugh. Sounds like Jack. He put up signs. He's a reasonable guy, but I guess his patience ran out. Serves him right, whoever it is. Sarah's journalistic senses were tingling. This was better than she'd hoped. She crossed the street to the pristine, eerily uniform housing development. It didn't take long to find someone willing to talk about Karen. They spoke of her reign as HOA president in hushed, fearful tones. They told stories of citations for improperly rolled-up hoses, of fierce arguments over the precise shade of flowers permitted in front gardens, of a tyranny of trivialities that made daily life an exercise in anxiety. A picture began to form a quiet, respected veteran on one side, and a petty, widely disliked suburban dictator on the other. The narrative was writing itself. Back inside the workshop, the battery on Karen's phone ticked down to 7%. Desperation forced her into action. She had to find another way out. The main door was a fortress. But what about the rest of the building? She began a systematic search, her expensive shoes crunching on the dusty concrete floor. The workshop was vast and orderly, a testament to the methodical mind of its owner. Tools hung on pegboards in perfect silhouette. Metal stock was neatly stacked on racks. There were no other doors. No windows, except for a few grimy panes of reinforced glass high up near the ceiling. Far out of reach, in the back corner, behind a heavy canvas curtain. She found a small, makeshift office, a simple metal desk, a worn-out chair, a filing cabinet. This was his inner sanctum, driven by a desperate hope for a key, a hidden release, anything. She began to rifle through his things. She pulled open a desk drawer. Instead of a key, she found a small, velvet-lined box. She opened it. Inside, resting on faded silk, were a purple heart and a bronze star medal. They were heavy in her hand, imbued with a gravity she couldn't comprehend. On the wall above the desk was a single, framed photograph. A much younger Jack Huda, in uniform, stood with his arm around a smiling woman, a young girl perched on his shoulders. They looked happy, complete. Karen stared at the photo, at the medals, and for the first time, a sliver of a thought, an unwelcome and deeply uncomfortable thought, pierced through her self-pity. This workshop wasn't just a space, it was his. It belonged. The sight of the medals did not trigger a miraculous transformation within Karen. There was no sudden, profound empathy that washed away a lifetime of narcissism. Instead, the polished metal and faded ribbons served as a stark, alien testament to a world she had never known and could not comprehend. This man, Huda, had bled for his country. He had faced dangers she couldn't imagine, and she had treated his sanctuary, the quiet space he had earned, as her personal parking overflow. The thought wasn't a moral epiphany, it was a strategic miscalculation. She had picked a fight with the wrong person. It was the first time in her adult life that she felt she had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. And the realization was terrifying. She dropped the medals back into the box as if they were hot, rummaging further, her desperation fueled by the phone's now dead screen. She found no keys, no hidden buttons, only invoices for steel, schematics for custom fabrication jobs, and a dog-eared copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. A passage was underlined in pencil. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. She stared at the words, a bitter, ironic laugh catching in her throat. He hadn't just been unlike her. He had used her own arrogance as the raw material for her cage. Hours bled into one another. The initial adrenaline gave way to a deep, gnawing exhaustion. Thirst became her primary torment. Her throat was raw from the chemical dust and the dry, stale air. She found a spigot in the corner with a coiled green hose, intended for cleaning floors. After a moment of visceral hesitation, she drank from it. The tepid, metallic-tasting water, the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Humiliation was a flavor she was slowly, unwillingly acquiring. As dusk began to paint the high, grimy windows in shades of orange and purple, she curled up on the cold leather seat of her dust-shrouded car. The silence was absolute. No hum of traffic, no distant sirens, no neighborhood chatter. It was the sound of being erased. Sleep came not as a comfort, but as a surrender to the overwhelming power of her confinement. Outside, the story was exploding. Sarah Jenkins' initial web report, titled HOA President Trapped in Veterans Workshop After Parking Dispute, had gone viral. The combination of elements was irresistible internet catnip and entitled Karen, a combat veteran, a gloriously petty act of revenge, and a cherry red sports car. The local news segment was picked up by national outlets. By morning, hashtag Welder of Justice and hashtag Hudaman were trending on Twitter. Mimi's blossom Jack's face photoshopped onto the body of Hephaestus, forging a door in the fires of a volcano. Karen's frantic face peering through the door with the caption, "I'd like to speak to the metal fabricator." The story reached Jack's sister, Maria Huda, a sharp, no-nonsense corporate lawyer in Chicago. She saw her brother's name trending and felt a jolt of alarm that quickly morphed into a grim, protective pride as she read the details. She knew Jack. She knew his quiet nature, his deep respect for rules, and his even deeper intolerance for those who broke them with impunity. She also knew that his 3-week fishing trip was sacred and that he was completely unreachable. Deep in the Maine woods where cell service was a myth, he had no idea he had become a folk hero. Maria acted immediately. She flew to the town and retained a local law firm on her brother's behalf. Her first act was to issue a statement. Mr. Huda is a private citizen and a decorated veteran who has repeatedly requested that his private property be respected. The statement read, after multiple warnings were ignored, he took measures to secure his property. The individual currently occupying his workshop is a trespasser. Any damage to the property, including the discharge of a fire extinguisher, will be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. We consider the matter a civil dispute and expect the trespasser to bear all costs associated with her removal and the subsequent repairs. The statement was a masterstroke. It reframed the narrative from eccentric veteran kidnaps woman to property owner defends his rights against a recalcitrant trespasser. It also put the county and the police on notice. Their hand was forced, with the media circus growing and a high-powered lawyer now officially representing the property owner. They could no longer treat it as a low-priority civil matter they could ignore. The health and safety of the trespasser was now a potential liability. On the morning of the second day, Karen was awakened by a new sound, a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the concrete floor. Then, a loud, authoritative banging on the door. "This is the county fire department. We are going to breach the door. Please stand clear." A surge of triumphant relief shot through her. Finally, her rescue. She scrambled out of the car, her heart pounding. The world was coming to its senses. But her relief was short-lived. The sound that followed was not the clean click of a lock being picked. It was the terrifying, high-pitched scream of an industrial angle grinder biting into steel. A shower of brilliant orange sparks erupted along the seam Jack had welded, visible through the tiny gap. The noise was apocalyptic, a deafening shriek of metal being violently unmade. It went on for what felt like an eternity. The smell of hot metal filled the workshop, mingling with the lingering chemical tang of the fire extinguisher. This wasn't a rescue, it was a demolition. Finally, with a groan of tortured metal, a section of the door was pulled away by a hydraulic tool, creating a jagged, man-sized opening. Karen stumbled toward it, drawn by the promise of fresh air and freedom. As she stepped through the mangled doorway, she was blinded by a barrage of flashing lights. Camera shutters clicked like a swarm of angry insects. News crews, held back by a police line, surged forward. Microphones extended like weapons. Sarah Jenkins was at the forefront, her voice cutting through the din. "Karen, can you tell us what happened? Why did you repeatedly park in a veteran's private workshop after being asked not to?" Karen froze, a deer caught into the high beams of her own public crucifixion. She was a mess. Her hair was matted and dusted with white powder. Her expensive jacket was ruined. Her face was pale and drawn. She looked not like a victim, but like a creature that had crawled out from under a rock. She tried to form a sentence, to assert her authority, to condemn the man who had done this to her, but no words came. She was met not with sympathy, but with accusing eyes and probing questions. She saw the faces in the crowd, her neighbors. The ones she had fined for trivial infractions and saw not concern, but a cold, unmistakable schadenfreude. They were enjoying this. A police officer gently but firmly guided her toward a waiting car as she was led away. She saw Jack Huda standing calmly by the side, speaking to a fire captain and holding a clipboard. Maria's eyes met Karen's for a brief second. There was no pity in them, only the cool, dispassionate assessment of a problem being efficiently handled. In that moment, Karen understood that her ordeal wasn't over. It was just entering a new, more expensive phase. The next 3 weeks were a systematic dismantling of Karen's life. The story was the lead item on national news cycles for days. Her husband, Richard, a man whose entire existence was built on maintaining a facade of respectable success, was mortified. The national mockery, the endless phone calls, the shame of being married to welder Karen was too much. He moved out within a week, and his lawyer served her with divorce papers citing irreparable reputational damage. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to impeach her as president. She was a pariah in the very kingdom she had sought to rule. Then came the legal filings from Maria, a lawsuit seeking damages for trespassing, property damage for the fire extinguisher discharge, which had ruined several sensitive electronic tools, the cost of the fire department's forced entry, and the cost to install a new state-of-the-art security door. It was a sum that made her gasp. Her assets were frozen pending the outcome. Her world had not just crumbled, it had been atomized. Jack Huda returned home on a sunny afternoon 3 weeks later, his old truck smelling faintly of fish and pine needles. He felt rested, renewed. The peace of the wilderness had worked its magic. As he pulled into the industrial park, he saw it immediately. The mangled cut-up door of his workshop had been replaced by a gleaming, new heavy-duty steel roll-up door. A small, professionally printed sign was affixed next to it. Trespassers will be detained and prosecuted. All costs will be billed to the offender. Sal, the mechanic from next door, came jogging over, a wide grin on his face. "Huda, man, you're a legend. You've been on every news channel in the country." Jack just stared at him, then at the new door, completely baffled. What in the hell happened here? It took Sal and later Maria over the phone to explain the whole saga. Jack listened in stunned silence, a slow smile spreading across his face as the tale unfolded. He hadn't sought fame or notoriety. He had simply wanted to be left alone. He had wanted to secure his space. And in a strange, roundabout way, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. His quiet act of defiance had resonated with millions of people who were tired of everyday arrogance and casual disrespect. Months later, the legal battles were over. Karen, diminished and financially crippled, had settled out of court. She sold the red sports car and her large house, moving into a small, anonymous condo on the other side of the state. The settlement check that arrived in Jack's mailbox was substantial. He looked at it for a long time, then endorsed it over to a national charity that provides service dogs for wounded veterans. His workshop was his sanctuary once more. It was cleaner now, the new door gliding up and down with a whisper-quiet efficiency. He had his space, his quiet, his work. One afternoon, while polishing a piece of stainless steel, he paused and looked around. He thought of the chaos, the news vans, the rage of the woman in the orange jacket. Then he looked at the sign his sister had insisted on installing. He smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. The best revenge, he thought, wasn't just to be unlike your enemy. Sometimes it was building a better door and the world. It turned out, would beat a path to it. His world was finally, blessedly, quiet. The gears of society were, or somewhere, at least in his small corner of it, turning smoothly once more. Jack Huda's return was not to the simple quiet he had left behind. His small act of personal rebellion had, in his absence, become public domain. The story had taken on a life of its own, a modern fable for an age weary of entitlement. His workshop was no longer just another unit in a drab industrial park. It was a landmark. Cars would slow down as they passed, the occupants pointing, sometimes taking a quick photo before speeding off. Once, a local bakery left a box of donuts on his doorstep with a note scrawled in marker, "For the welder of justice. You're our hero." Jack accepted this new reality with the same stoic grace he applied to everything else. He would nod politely at the onlookers, accept the occasional handshake from a stranger at the hardware store, and then retreat back into the sanctuary he had fought so hard to protect. His sister, Maria, had handled the media storm with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate lawyer, shielding him from the worst of the attention. She had set up a P.O. box for the mountain of letters he received, some offering legal support, some containing cash donations, which he promptly forwarded to Maria for her to return, and many simply telling their own stories of dealing with neighborhood tyrants. He was, much to his own bewilderment, the reluctant patron saint of the fed-up, his new door, paid for by the preliminary settlement from Karen's frozen assets, was a marvel of engineering. It was thicker, reinforced, and operated with a whisper-quiet motor. It was his fortress of solitude's new drawbridge. But inside, nothing had changed. The smell of ozone and steel, the orderly rows of tools, the worn-out chair in his small office, it was all as he had left it. The world outside might have changed its opinion of him, but his world inside remained constant. This was the peace he craved. Meanwhile, for Karen, peace was a foreign country she had been exiled from. Her new life was a cramped, beige apartment overlooking a parking lot filled with sensible, unsporty cars. The vibrant colors of her former life, the cherry red of her car, the power orange of her jacket, the manicured green of her lawn had been replaced by the dull, anonymous palette of obscurity. She had been stripped of her titles: HOA president, respected community member, wife. Richard had finalized the divorce with brutal speed, his parting words a cold, clinical assessment. You have become a liability. Her days were long and empty. She would watch television for hours, the remote in her hand, flipping through channels, only to be ambushed by her own infamy. Her face, her name, her story. They had become shorthand for a certain kind of public shaming. She was a meme, a cautionary tale, a punchline. The shame was a physical presence, a weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the shame, something else festered, a hard, bitter kernel of rage in her mind. The narrative was skewed. She was the victim. She had been trapped, humiliated, her life dismantled piece by piece. The world celebrated the man who had done this to her while it vilified her. She saw Jack not as a man defending his property, but as a malicious saboteur who had orchestrated her downfall with cruel precision. One afternoon, a local news station ran a follow-up story on the one-year anniversary of the welding incident. They showed clips of Jack, quiet and dignified, refusing to comment. They interviewed Sal, the mechanic who called Jack a stand-up guy. They even spoke to a representative from the veterans charity that had received his settlement money, who praised his generosity. There was no mention of her suffering, her loss, her side of the story. That was the final straw. She couldn't live in the shadow of this narrative any longer. She needed to confront him, to see him face to face, to make him acknowledge what he had done to her. It wasn't a plan for revenge. She had no power left for that. It was a desperate, primal need to be seen, to have her suffering acknowledged by its architect. She drove her modest sedan, a car she still felt awkward in, back to the industrial park. It was the first time she had returned. Seeing the workshop, with its gleaming new door, sent a jolt of anger and remembered fear through her. The door was open today. A slice of warm, yellow light cut across the asphalt. She parked across the street, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched for nearly an hour, gathering a courage she didn't know she had. Finally, she got out of the car and walked across the street, her steps feeling both heavy and unsteady, as if walking on a deck of a ship in a storm. Jack was at his workbench, his back to the door, a grinder in his hand sending a cascade of sparks into the air. He was so engrossed in his work, he didn't hear her approach. "Mr. Huda," she said. Her voice was thin, reedy. The grinder fell silent. Jack turned around slowly, lifting his safety visor. He looked at her, and his face registered no surprise, no anger, no fear. There was only a quiet, weary recognition. He placed the grinder carefully on the workbench before giving her his full attention. "Ma'am," he said, his voice even. The lack of reaction unnerved her. She had rehearsed a speech filled with accusations and fury, but faced with his profound calm, the words felt hollow. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. A stupid question, but it was all she could manage. "I do," he said. "You ruined my life," she blurted out, the words tasting like ash. "Everything. You took everything from me." Jack leaned back slightly against his workbench, crossing his arms. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself. He just listened, his eyes never leaving hers. "I secured my property, ma'am. I put a weld on my door after my signs and my notes were ignored. That's all I did. Everything that happened after that happened because of choices you made. You chose to park in here. You chose to set off a fire extinguisher. You chose to build a reputation that made your neighbors celebrate when you fell." Each sentence was a calm, factual statement, delivered without malice, but it dismantled her self-pity piece by piece. "You could have just called a tow truck," she shot back, her voice rising. "You didn't have to be so cruel, so theatrical. A tow truck was the next step. Jack said calmly, but you didn't give me a chance. You went from parking in front of my workshop to occupying it. You escalated it. You crossed a line from being an inconvenience into being an invader. So I built a barrier. That's what I do. I build things. I'm a fabricator. You saw a garage. I saw a line that needed to be drawn in steel. She stared at him, searching for a crack in his composure, a flicker of the same rage that consumed her. She found nothing. Why? She finally whispered, the question at the heart of her obsession. Why go to such lengths? It was just a parking spot. Jack was silent for a long moment. He looked past her, toward the small office in the back. This place, it's more than a workshop, he said, his voice softening for the first time. I came back from 20 years in the service. I saw things. I lost people. He gestured vaguely toward the office. My wife, she passed away while I was on my last tour. Cancer. I wasn't there. This place. He looked around the cavernous space, is where I came to put myself back together. It's quiet. It's orderly. The rules are simple. Metal gets hot. It bends. You cut it. You weld it. It becomes something new. It makes sense. The world outside. He gestured vaguely toward the manicured suburbs beyond. Doesn't always make sense. People don't always respect the lines. He looked back at her, his gaze direct and heavy. You didn't just take a parking spot, ma'am. You brought the chaos and the noise and the disrespect into the one place on earth I have where those things aren't allowed. It wasn't about the car. It was about the peace you were shattering. Karen had no response. His explanation wasn't an attack. It was a truth she couldn't argue with, a perspective so foreign to her own that it completely disarmed her. She had been so consumed with her own perceived status and convenience that the idea that the space had a deeper, almost sacred meaning to its owner had never occurred to her. She had seen a man, he had seen an intruder. There's a quote I read once, Jack continued, almost to himself. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. I didn't weld that door because I hated you. I welded it because I needed to protect this. My actions weren't about you at all. They were about me. They were about preserving this. The finality in his voice was absolute. Karen realized then that she would get nothing from him. No apology, no remorse, no satisfaction. He didn't hate her enough to give her that. She was, and always had been, an external problem that he had solved with the tools at his disposal. She had come seeking a final battle and found only a closed case. She turned and walked away without another word. As she crossed the street back to her sensible car, she felt not anger, but a profound and hollow emptiness. The story was over. She had finally understood her role in it. She wasn't the victim. She wasn't even the villain. She was just the catalyst. Jack watched her go. He felt no triumph, only a faint sadness. He picked up the grinder again, but paused. The encounter had stirred something in him. The fame, the letters, the confrontation, it had all highlighted a truth. He had protected his sanctuary. But what was it for? Just for him, he walked into his office and looked at the picture of his wife and daughter. He thought about the settlement check, the money born from such a strange conflict. He thought about the veterans' charity. An idea, which had been slowly forming in the back of his mind, now crystallized, much like the idea for the weld had, but this one felt warm. Constructive. The next day, he called Maria, then he called the charity. 6 months later, the workshop was transformed. The front half was still Jack's private domain, but the back half, once used for storage, had been cleaned out and retrofitted with 2 new welding bays and workstations. On Saturday mornings, it was no longer quiet. It was filled with the low murmur of voices and the hiss of welding torches. Jack had partnered with the charity to start a small, weekend program, Steel Sanctuary. He was teaching basic welding and metal fabrication to a handful of young veterans, men and women trying to find their own footing and after their service. He taught them how to cut straight, how to lay a clean bead, how to take raw, unyielding material and shape it into something useful and knew. He was teaching them a trade, but it was more than that. He was sharing his piece. He was showing them how the focus required to fuse two pieces of metal together could also fuse the fractured pieces of a life. His folk hero status faded, as all internet fame does, but his legacy was being forged. Week by week, in his own workshop, he had defended his sanctuary not just for himself, but so he could open its doors to others who needed one. He had discovered that the truest peace wasn't found in shutting the world out, but in building something meaningful inside the walls you've secured. One Saturday, as he watched a young former Marine concentrate intently, her face illuminated by the brilliant blue light of the arc, he smiled. It was the best project he had ever built. The story of Karen and the welder is a reminder that every act of disrespect comes with a price. Arrogance led to a humiliating end, while quiet resistance delivered an unforgettable dose of payback. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts on this epic revenge.